Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of José Arroyo in Conversation with. Today, I'm talking to Matt Hayes, who is a journalist who's been published in The Guardian, The New York Times, a regular reviewer for Cineast and many film magazines. But the reason I wanted to talk to him today is because he's co-editor of a series of books modeled on the BFI classics, but really talking about classics of queer cinema. First for Arsenal Press for many years, and now I believe with McGill-Queen's. Yeah. So hello, Matt.
Good morning.
um, Tell me a little bit about how the series came about, what inspired it.
Well, it was interesting. I had just come through quite a busy, very busy period, and my book had come out, which I'll plug here. My book with Divine on the cover, The View from Here, and
Mm.
it just won. It actually just won a Lambda Award, and so Tom Waugh said we have to have lunch because I'm really angry that I haven't won a Lambda and you have. So it was very sweet. He had me over for a congratulatory lunch. It was very, very supportive and sweet. And he was very instrumental in helping me with the book, working on the book. And we were talking, and he said, we had discussed various editions of the BFI series, which we're big fans of. And he said, what we should really do, it was really Tom's idea. He said, we really should give seasoned writers and up and coming writers a chance to do a monograph, a single book on a single film. And he said, I just love with the BFI series that, writers can really go in depth. And we talked about the tone of the series. We wanted it to be, to have obviously academic rigor, but to be accessible. So that the books would be very readable and reader friendly. And that's the tone that we've really aimed for with the series. We started at Arsenal Pulp. We approached Arsenal Pulp. My book and he had a number of books published there. They're a Vancouver-based publisher, Brian Lab and Robert Ballantyne, who are really great guys, really fantastic and very supportive. And they loved the idea. We started it we saw it as a finite series.
Mm.
And then I think we had originally commissioned about 25 books. In the end, we got 19 volumes. So people drop out for various reasons. Things come up in life. And then when we finished it, Quill and Quire, which is a Canadian books magazine on books and publishing, did a very nice profile of the series and said, well, here it is. It's come to a close. And we were reflecting on it. It was a lovely article that they did on us and the series. And we were very happy with it because we had got reviews in academic publications saying this is a really interesting series that has expanded the canon, the thinking of what the queer canon is. And we'd also been written about in places like the Washington Post and the New York Times. Andrew Holleran did a review of several of the titles in the Washington Post, which was great. And the New York Times interviewed me about the series. We thought it was done. And then a couple of publishers, notably McGill-Queen's University Press, Jonathan Crago, contacted us and said, well, we don't think this should be over. What have you got? Let's put out a call for more titles. And so we're reborn again at McGill-Queen's, which has been really exciting.
Hmm. Tell me a little bit about the process of, I suppose, determining which films count as classics. What kind of thinking went behind that? What was
Well,
the rationale
well,
for?
that's a really good question. I mean, there are obvious ones like Will Aitken did a great book on Death in Venice. Lucas Hildebrandt did a wonderful one on Paris is Burning. Those maybe seem like more obvious titles, but we also like the idea that if a single author could make the case that this is why this is an important film, why they feel it's a classic film, that then they make that argument in the book, even if it's a lesser known film. And we like that idea because, of course, we have more obvious titles like Strangers on a Train, or as I said, Death in Venice. Those are more obvious ones. But we rejected some proposals. Like we had several proposals on Brokeback Mountain, but we felt that film had deservedly got a lot of attention. And I myself have reviewed like at least 2 anthologies up on Brokeback Mountain. We really wanted to try, if we could, to reserve some of our titles for perhaps undiscovered films or overlooked films, so that we could kind of expand ideas around, as you say, what constitutes a classic, because of course that's really subjective and contentious, right? So we wanted to really expand ideas around that, and that's something that I think that we've done quite well. Got a few books here. Well, this is a lovely book that John Davies did on Trash, the Warhol film, and I love that. That's a great book. We just had this is really exciting in the new series. Two trans authors, academics, have written a book on Boys Don't Cry, Chase Joint and Morgan Page. And so they're actually kind of basically reclaiming and rethinking that film, which has become a problematic film for a lot of people.
Mm.
And it's a really fantastic book. This is just hot off the presses. So, we've had a lot of, and then Robert Cagle did a book on Scorpio Rising. That's the only short film that we have in the series, the Kenneth Anger film. So,
Yeah.
We had a broad range of different kinds of titles, and it's really exciting. It's really exciting going forward. We're going to put out another 25 books,
Mhm.
so we've got a lot in the new series.
I want to talk a little bit about the Arsenal titles and the Queen's one, the McGill-Queen's one separately, because it seemed to me that kind of one of the interesting, well, there were, I think, many interesting things about the first series. One is that I hesitate to use the word disproportionate, because I think it's a good thing, right? But there's a lot of Canadian titles, and disproportionate to what one would expect, say, from a list published out of London or New York.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about, to what extent was kind of, representative Canadian content part of the mission?
Well, that's a really good question. And both Tom and I have taught. I think you probably taught the course too when you were at Concordia. But both Tom and I have taught Canadian cinema classes and queer cinema. So we feel there's a crossover, a degree of crossover, but also, to be perfectly honest, from the vantage point of Arsenal Pulp Press, they're not really an academic publisher per se. They're a publisher. And in Canadian publishing, of course, one needs to get Canada Council funding. So we needed to say, look, we've got Canadian content in this series. We're not just going to go out to write about Hollywood films or European films or Asian films. We're going to write about things from the home country, from Canada. So we wanted to have a number of Canadian authors, and we also wanted to have Canadian films we were discussing. As it turns out, that's not hard to do. With my book, The View from Here, I noted when I wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail saying, gee, it's funny how many of the chapters in the book were on Canadian filmmakers. And so I sort of pondered why it seemed part of it is government involvement in funding. These funding agencies will often help queer filmmakers, and also Canadian film itself is kind of it's marginal, right? It's marginal. It's almost like horror movies. It's like what David Cronenberg says about horror movies, right? It's just it is entirely marginal, and Canadian cinema is like that. So we're a little bit on the fringes. Brad Fraser once made the argument to me that Canada is like Canada's the gay country to America's straight bully, right? We're essentially a queer country. So that all kind of factors into it.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing. It's an unusual thing, and hopefully it kind of brings some attention, to those films. The other thing that caught my eye in the first series was, I suppose, were there any discussions? So obviously there were discussions about what constitutes a classic, but were there also discussions about what constitutes a film? So I might be misremembering, but it seems to me that John Grayson's Zero Patience, was that a film or was that a video art?
Oh no, that's a film. That's a feature film. That
Okay.
was then. I remember writing about. Was one of the first cover stories I did for Extra when that film was being made, and Jeremy Podeswa was the unit publicist.
Hmm.
So I was dealing with him and interviewed John for was a cover story for Extra about Zero Patience, and that was then his biggest budget film to date. He was very excited to have budget to do it, and I mean that's a really interesting film because of course Robin Wood got out a chainsaw and wrote a scathing review of it in Cine Action, absolutely scathing. So then there were responses to Robin Wood's attack on the film. It's really interesting and also really interesting now, especially in light of the fact that the patient zero theory has been completely debunked in the past few years. And Laurie Lind made a really wonderful film called Killing Patient Zero documentary, which John Grayson is in, and it's a really great documentary which goes into it. I think that book by Susan Nabe and Wendy Pearson, and they did a fantastic job. This is I think one of the best books in the series. They did a really good job of um, analyzing exactly what John was up to, both the kind of theory he was bringing to the project, but also the kind of street activism that he was bringing to the film, and they really got it. And I think it's like again it's full of academic rigor, but it's very accessible. It's a great read. This is a really magnificent book. I love it as much as I love the film.
The other thing that caught my eye was the Boys in the Sand, LA Lays Itself
Yeah.
book. So I think kind of, porn has been such a kind of crucial and critical part of all kinds of queer cultures. And it's certainly unexpected to see in a series like this. So again, I just wondered kind of, what conversations went around that decision.
Well, heading into this with Tom, uh, I figured with Tom Waugh there was going to be porn, and I was very, as you say, porn has been so influential. Boys in the Sand is such an interesting film, and Wakefield Poole was very generous with me with his time for the chapter that I did on him in my book. So I was thrilled when Cindy Patton pitched that idea of the two very sort of oppositional films in the porn canon. And then to have a lesbian writing about it, just to me, it seemed really titillating and really interesting, and it's an interesting volume. Um, and the whole positive image, negative image thing, it's so fascinating. It's so fascinating. It's so much of queer representation. It seems like it's a reaction to what's come before. Um, Vito Russo's call for more positive images, and then the new queer cinema is like push back on that. And people emboldened by the AIDS crisis. I find all of that really, really fascinating. And now there's like we're going through another round of like, gee, why can't a gay rom-com make it at the box office? Right? I just find it really interesting. These debates go on. Well, Dahmer, obviously, also Dahmer. These debates go on and on and on and on. And Tar, of course, Tar is getting a lot of. I haven't seen it yet, but it's getting a lot of pushback because of the central figure in the film.
Hmm. Um, I thinking about Boys in the Sand and LA Lays Itself. It's hard to imagine now that films would be essential or have the importance that those two did. Partly because, all of the porn industry has changed so much. I think, maybe up to the 80s, you could point to something, I don't know, like Power Tool, which, you imagine that everyone or a large portion of gay men of a particular generation would have seen. Whereas, that is no longer the case, really. So I think, kind of very, very interesting choice of films to discuss, from a particular point in time. So moving on to the new series, one of the things that strikes me most is the design, which, not to trash the other, series, but it seems so much more vibrant and it really catches your eye. And I wonder what kind of discussions went around, the design of the new series and also, publishing and marketing and kind of getting it out there.
Um, we were uh, very specific in our concerns that we wanted to make sure that the books got attention. This is trickier and trickier and trickier all the time, as anyone in the publishing business will acknowledge. Is that all the newspapers now have just cut back on their cultural coverage, and that includes books. It just they don't see it generating advertising or clicks. And it's unfortunate. I mean, the Globe and Mail used to have a pull-out book sections. The reason I picked up the Globe every Saturday was for that book section. I wrote for it myself sometimes. And of course, and then you pick up the Times on Sunday, the New York Times on Sunday, and the Guardian, and you'd read about books. And there's just less and less coverage. It's harder and harder to get traction, is the word I use, some attention for books. When my book came out, 15 years ago. It was reviewed across the country into various alternative publications and newspapers. And I was interviewed about it on the CBC, and you got your coverage. It's so much harder now, and these titles they're coming out. So we're doing things like blog posts and interviews like this really help. Thank you very much to get word out about the books. But it's tricky. We did do some ads. We did some ads in both Cineast. I think we had an ad in Film Comment, of course, which isn't publishing right now, but we also in the Gay and Lesbian Review, and we may try to do more ads to get some attention for the series. It's harder and harder to get editorial space, and as a freelancer, I know when pitching stories, it's really tricky to get an editor to say, okay, I'll commission you to do this. But there was never much money in it, but now there's even less. It's harder and harder and harder to get it, to get somebody to agree to a profile of an author or a book review.
Well, the series looks terrific now, and I think I think that will really help. What did you learn from the first series? Yeah, kind of, so you did a whole batch and you thought it was a finite kind of series. What did you learn from that first series? And in fact, when did it start? When did you start publication?
We started about 15 years ago, so it's just after my book came out. What I learned was that academics have very different attitudes towards deadlines than that journalists do. And some people, because Arsenal Pulp was not an academic press, the idea of somebody just saying, well, I need another 6 months. Thanks so much for understanding. At McGill-Queen's, that's fine. We're not counting our eggs till they're hatched, right? Like it's kind of obvious. But at Arsenal Pulp, there was a tendency to announce, say we're going to announce the books in the catalog for the upcoming season, and then someone would say, well, look, I had too much teaching to do, or I had this other deadline, and that became a problem at times with certain authors. And one book actually just got ditched. I mean, we just had to abandon it because the publishers were really unhappy with the attitude of the author, who was saying, well, gee, I'm an academic, so it's just how it works in academia. We push things ahead all the time. So it was interesting to see those kind of worlds clash a bit. Having one foot in journalism and one foot in academia has been really interesting for me, because, of course, if I'm working as a journalist and I'm getting paid, I know that if I miss that deadline and I don't have a very good explanation for it up front, I'm going to just be canceled. I'm not going to get the money, and I'm not going to ever be invited back. So it's a wonderful thing for a procrastinator to be a journalist, because it just forces you to get things done. And that's part of the reason I think I was drawn to journalism, because I'm really bad at procrastinating. So, but academic deadlines are just the worst, because you can just keep kicking the ball down. I've seen it with so many people. I mean, people who do brilliant dissertations, and I'm like, this has to be a book. You have to develop this into a book. And they never do, or they just, or some people, of course, never finish their PhDs and abandon them, which is also can be quite traumatizing. So, these things are, these ideas of deadlines and getting things done are, I just learned a lot about it, and how different brains work. Tom is really impressive. Tom Waugh is incredibly impressive because you know him very well. He's a dedicated workaholic. He is the personification of the Protestant work ethic. He never stops working. He will call me on Christmas Day and say, "Why isn't this done?" And I'm like, "I'm in Calgary at my brother's place. I don't have my desktop with me. I don't know what you're talking about." And he's like, "Well, why isn't this done?" I'm like, "It's a holiday," and he doesn't understand that. Tom just doesn't get it. So he works and works and works. He never misses a deadline. Never. He gets everything done on time, if not early. And it's a very impressive work ethic. I will never live up to it, but I'm impressed by it.
Tell me a little bit more about what other things you learned, either about commissioning or indeed about the practical editing of work, or about, subsequently kind of, what worked better, what didn't work better, and how that might have influenced your selection of future titles, say.
Well, I think one of the things that I think is really important in the series, and one of the things that we often came back to people with, is in their proposal, they'd say, this is why this film was really important to me. I first saw it at this time in my life, and it had this huge impact on me. And then when we would read the book, the manuscript, a lot of times that personal element wasn't there. That anecdote about when they first saw it, or when they were teaching it, and how revelatory the film was to them, both the first time they saw it in the classroom. And so we would come back and say, the personal stories that you have, that's part of the book.
Mm.
How the film struck you, how the film changed you. And so I really love that the people writing the books talk personally and intimately about what the film meant to them, and
Mm.
how it impacted them. Because I think that should be part of any book, about a film like this, in this series. And so that's something that we really try to incorporate and try to bring out in our writers, and that's been very I think it's been very successful.
Okay. Um, so after this experience of, roughly 15 years of doing this first series, you've now got how many coming out?
We've got approximately, I believe, 25 books coming out.
Uh,
um
of which I
we
think 5 are now out.
Yeah, we've commissioned more, but we are, as often happens, life happens, and sometimes people say, "Well, I'm not going to," some people are like slated to submit a manuscript in like 10 years, right? So some people might not be, and I'm actually working on one myself, on
Which one are you?
the legendary documentary about sex work in Vancouver called Hookers on Davie,
Ah,
which I'm
right.
sure you
Okay.
know.
Yeah.
I love that film. I've been teaching it really every year for probably 15 years. I taught it in the queer cinema class, and teach it in my documentary class now at Concordia. And it's really a remarkable film by Janice Cole and Holly Dale, about very frank film about sex work from 1984, about people working in the streets of Vancouver. And I love that film, and it was way ahead of its time in its inclusion of trans sex workers. And the filmmakers really had to fight to include everyone in the film. So I'm really excited about that project.
And what can we look forward to?
Uh, what do we have coming out? We have a book on Orlando coming out that's magnificent. David Greven has written a book on Maurice, which is great. Chris Dupuis has written a wonderful book on the Canadian film Winter Kept Us Warm,
Hmm.
which was the first Canadian English language Canadian film to be invited to Cannes.
Hmm.
And it's a gay love story, as I'm sure you know that film as well, Winter Kept Us Warm by David Sector. Um, and Tom and I both love that film. And in fact, the filmmaker David Sector, now in his 70s, I mean, he said that he has credited Tom with keeping that film alive, keeping it in the public eye, because it would have fallen into obscurity had it not been for Tom consistently writing about it and insisting that gay film festivals and Canadian film festivals screen it. So it's a really interesting book, and I think that Chris did a really great job with it. I thought I knew the film like the back of my hand, but I learned new things from the book. So Chris did some really interesting research.
So these are all ones that are already in-house, so to speak, and just waiting to be published, yeah?
Yeah, they're going through the pipeline right now, peer review and everything else. That's also different. We didn't have uh, anonymous peer reviewers at Arsenal Pulp, and now obviously at McGill-Queen's, being an academic publishing house, we do.
Oh,
And
that's
so
interesting.
that's also really an interesting process to watch and to see how that works
It is
inside the company.
interesting because has that affected so one of the things about the BFI series is that, they often publish just like, I suppose celebrated but non-academic writers on a particular film, right? I think Salman Rushdie did one on The Wizard of Oz, say.
Yes, yeah.
Um, so it now going through peer review, does it affect your commissioning?
No, no. In fact, I think we've commissioned. It's closed now that we're not taking any new pitches. So we think we've commissioned all the books for
Mm.
now, anyway, unless McGill-Queen's opens it up again.
Yeah, but do you have as many non-academic writers as you did, say, in the first series?
Uh, there, I think we had more academic writers this time around, and one of the reasons for that, I think, is because when we reopened it, uh, put notices out on academic listservs, and and wrote, and someone did an article in the CBC, on the CBC website, about it, saying we're open again for proposals. We were really overwhelmed by the number of proposals we got and how great they were. It was a lot of work going through them. It
Mm.
was a lot of work trying to figure out which ones we could take on and which ones we couldn't. And we were just really impressed by the number of people who said, we love the first series. A lot of the authors said, we really want to be part of this. So we were very lucky because we got enough press and enough attention with the first round that we were really blown away. And that's the most difficult part. That's the most painful part of both series, was when Tom and I had to sit down a couple of very long meetings and go through all these proposals and decide which ones we were going to commission and which ones we felt we couldn't. And a very, very difficult process, because we had some really great proposals, and we just only had so many books that we could, only slots that we could fill.
Mm. Um, that's always, a consideration, kind of one always has to turn people down. But to move the conversation a little bit in another direction, kind of, and without meaning to put you on the spot, can you just mention some of your favorites from the first series, and ones that have spoken to you in the current series as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I really feel that Will Aiken is just a remarkable writer, and so his book on Death in Venice, then that's a really old classic film. He really breathed a lot of new life into it.
I've read it. I love it. Yeah.
I love it. I mean, his writing is often compared to chocolate. Andrew Holleran compared it to fine chocolate in the Washington Post, which is a lovely title line. And Will told me that that's not the first time his writing has been likened to chocolate, which I love. Um, but I also feel like Lucas Hildebrandt did a really great job with Paris is Burning,
Mm.
because of course that film has come under a lot of criticism for basically cultural appropriation. It's a white middle class lesbian making the film. And I thought that he very artfully and very gracefully talked about all of the problematic aspects of the film, but still managed to come around to defending the film. He obviously really loves the film, and did it in a really, I thought, really brilliant way. And I think it's a really fine book. It's one I'm going to look back on. Um, but I'm really proud of this. Maria Sanfilippo wrote this book, a new book for us on. I'm sorry, it's just a black, just a hardcover, so it's just on appropriate behavior, which is a bisexual romantic comedy, and it again, it's sort of a title that isn't very well known, but she does a really great job with this new book that we've got coming out. And the other one I was going to bring up was the other one that I really loved was Robbie Schwartzwald's book on Crazy.
Oh.
And that also is, that film is seen as problematic by some people. The late straight director Jean-Marc Vallée just died a couple of years ago, tragically at 58. Died quite suddenly. But that's straight director making a film about gay youth. But it's like Robbie does a really great job, I think, of coming around and discussing the film in depth and his own reaction to it, and it's I love the film Crazy. I've taught it. It's a beautiful, beautiful film. Yeah, wonderful film, and I think that I'm really glad that Robbie, who's written so much about Quebec culture and really understands it so well, was able to talk about it in depth and to bring such vibrance to the film and to honor it. And I think that he did a really great job. So I love that book. But I have to be honest with you. I hate to sound like this, but I'm really proud of the series in its entirety. I think it's really, really interesting. And Glyn Davis, British academic, wrote a review of it at one point, and said that we were helping to reimagine the canon, the queer canon, and that was just one of the most lovely compliments I could imagine getting, because that he's a very respected scholar, and that's what we were really aiming to do, was to have people think about new and different ways of thinking about what constitutes the canon, and then that's what he said. So I was like, wow, that's just our dream to hear that.
All right, Matt. Well, we're almost running out of time. Thank you very much for talking to us. Very best wishes for the rest of the series. I think they look terrific. I've already seen some of the titles, and it's a terrific series. And I hope your readership only increases with time.
Oh,
So
thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us on. This is really sweet, and I love that you smoked during the interview. I don't know if you remember, Jean-Luc Godard used to fly in by Concorde, and then he would come to Montreal and lecture at Concordia once a week. He was lecturing, and he apparently just sat on stage and smoked. And
yes,
just
well, these are different times, and I'm afraid I've lapsed. So, I'll get back to the non-smoking soon.